buttons at the top. Yep. Bam.
Has that been improved?
It is. Thanks so much.
Not at all.
Welcome everybody to the Human Rights and Protocols Considerations Research Group meeting. We are going to start briefly, just letting everybody get in the room and settled. If you're presenting, so Gershabad, Ava, if you're here, I'd be really happy if you wanted to test your video, your audio. I'm going to try to present your slides for you, but if we can do your own video share or screen share, that'd be ideal. In the interest of time, oh, I'm sorry, Gershabad, you were waiting in the queue. I didn't see you. Can you request again? Thanks.
Hi.
Excellent. We can hear you and see you. Right. So welcome to the Human Rights Protocols Considerations Research Group meeting. We have the agenda in front of you. We're going to have 2 talks, followed by 2 discussions and updates on group drafts. And then at the end, we'll also have an update on an ongoing discussion that this group has had around its publication of research within the group. But before we begin, I'd just like to ask if anybody wouldn't mind checking the Jabber, which is very helpfully in Meet Echo. So I don't know if we have to monitor it too closely, but if folks could just help by getting in the queue if there is discussion on the Jabber that needs to be said at the mic, that would be very helpful. And what I really need is a note taker. If somebody could indicate in the chat that they'd be willing to lead on notes, I'd appreciate it. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate it. So now we've got a note taker, we've got our eyes on Jabber. I think we can start. So in the first place, and I've already gone over the agenda. I need to sort out my tech. There we go. The note well applies in the IRTF as well as the IETF, so please make sure that you read it. We've got it helpfully broken down into, I think, 3 main chunks. First on intellectual property, and the second on privacy and code of conduct. Actually, they're just 2 chunks. So wanted to reiterate the goals of the IRTF, which are the same as the goals of the HRPC, since we are a research group. We're looking at the long-term effects both ways, human rights and protocols. And so we align with these goals. The Human Rights and Protocols Considerations Research Group was chartered to research how protocols strengthen and threaten human rights, as defined both in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. You can read more about past products, including a video and other blogs and things on hrpc.io, which is now a static site, I believe. And specifically within the Charter, we have the objectives to expose the relation, because there is a relation, it's often just hidden, between protocols and human rights by focusing specifically on 2 rights, the right to freedom of expression and opinion, and the right to freedom of association and assembly. There are other human rights, of course, but these are the two that we focus on. We treat others as well as they come up. We also have been working to propose guidelines that protect the internet as a human rights enabling environment. We've taken inspiration from others who've done this work for a very long time in the IETF, especially on privacy considerations. So those guidelines, which we'll talk about later in the meeting today, are really meant to help authors and protocol developers think about what might be the human rights considerations. So yeah, Gurshad will give us more on that later. And then we want to increase awareness in both ways, which is often why we have talks at the beginning of all of our meetings about human rights, the human rights community into the technical community. And for sure, we often talk about the IRTF, HRPC, and the IETF in human rights spaces. It's a place where human rights advocates need to pay attention to. In the past, we've worked on all of these things that are listed on this slide. We've done internet drafts. We've even published outside in policy academic papers about the work. Like I mentioned before, there's a film based on interviews. And there's also some data analysis and visualization and protocol analysis. These are all ongoing products of ours. I won't go over this too much, but just to say that our last milestone was in October 2017 when RFC 8280 was published. And this is sort of the baseline for a lot of the work we are doing. It was sort of the inaugural research into human rights protocol considerations. We have 2 current drafts. We're going to hear about both of them today and where they're at, which is very exciting. And then that's it as far as the intro slides. Just checking the queue and the chat. I know that one of our speakers is having a hard time getting into Data Tracker. I don't know how to resolve that and also chair and facilitate this meeting. But if there's a MeetEcho person on the line, if you could try to help with that, that would be great. Niels, do you want to jump in the queue and say what you've said in the chat? Is there more discussion? Okay, here we go. I think you're able to speak now, Niels, if you want. No?
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Great. So I thought maybe we could add the adoption of later drafts, such as draft association and draft political, and draft guidelines to the milestones as well, and also mention them on hrpc.io, because the latest blog on hrpc.io is the fact that you became co-chair, which is already a while ago, so it might be nice if that be updated.
That's a good point. I think there was actually sort of a plan to make that website static, but I think if we view it as still being a useful place to continue publishing, we certainly can do that.
Yeah, just a little note,
Okay. Do other people have thoughts on that? I mean, yeah. Okay. We can also use the data tracker also to create milestones and talk about these things. Okay, so because our first speaker is having login issues, I think that we should just go to our second talk. So Simon, I hate to spring this on you, but if you'd be ready, if you're ready, we could have you present now. We'll just change the order. Great. So Simon, we can see you. Do you want to also share your own slides, or shall I do that for you?
I'll say next slide. It's probably easier that I don't attempt three forms of media streaming all at once. I suspect that's beyond my capacity, as we would all embarrassingly find halfway.
I can tell you that it's a lot, but I do want to just shout out to the Meet Echo folks, because this is so great to have everything in one place. It's just a lot of like toggling around. All right, I think we're, I'm going to share my screen in a sec, and then we'll be ready to go.
Now, here we are. Here are the opening things. So probably a little bit of explanation as to who I am and what it is that I was thinking of when I was going through this. Simon McGar is my name. I have a consultancy firm called Data Compliance Europe, but my other hat is that I'm a practicing solicitor in Dublin, in Ireland. And using that hat, I've been representing Digital Rights Ireland before the Irish and European courts in their various cases for nearly, a decade and a half now. And so one of the issues that has come up recently is the question of applying data protection law, ensuring that we can build some sort of a trustworthy app environment to COVID tracing apps. So I thought I'd take you through some of the theory that we use, but also some of the practical things that were done in Ireland to try and advocate for a good outcome, and also the framework that we used to advocate to the state as to what a good outcome would look like, and what we asked them to come up to the mark on, which, to give them their due, spoiler near the end, they've done pretty well. So let's go for the next slide. So first of all, tracing apps might be good. There's a requirement to try and do contact tracing as quickly as possible. There's a very significant and well-cited recent piece of research published by Nature, which suggested that one, contact tracing was going to be particularly difficult using COVID-19 as its basis, because effectively the disease would be more infectious than you could throw enough people at it to find all the contacts. And therefore, what was key was making the distance between notifying people that they should self-isolate and the moment when you became aware of that problem as short as possible. So the idea was create a contact tracing app framework inside the country, where everyone would install it on their phones, and they would then learn by way of a beep and a notification that someone that their phone had been near using Bluetooth had been diagnosed with COVID. And they would then be asked to put themselves into self-isolation and go get tested themselves. And this was the model. And that's a good idea if it works. And there's a very large asterisk over the question, the phrase, if it works. But really, we want to look at the question of not only not does it work, but how would it work? So let's push on to the next slide. Thanks a million. And we run into this question. So in the EU, you may only process data with a legal basis to do so. And those legal bases are set out in Articles 6 and 9 of the GDPR, and they're derived from the case law from the court in Luxembourg, the CJEU, and from the Charter of Fundamental Rights. The consequence of the Charter of Fundamental Rights being incorporated in by the Treaty of Lisbon into EU law is that it is the fundamental law of the entire EU. Any piece of law which is enacted by either a member state or even the European Commission or an institution of the EU can be rendered invalid if it conflicts with that human right. And in this case, the right that we're considering is the right to data protection, which is a right alike, but in addition to the right to privacy. So you have to choose a legal basis, and the state here and states elsewhere were having to choose which one of the legal bases would they choose. And you could choose legislative requirement, you could make it the law that you had to have it, you could have it by consent, You could assert that there was a necessity under public health, or you could assert that there was a necessity under legitimate interest. And for lots of reasons, mostly because liberal democracies don't like the idea that you would install a mandatory tracking app in the phones of everybody in the country, they decided they would go to make sure that they relied on consent. So consent is the model that has been chosen for the EU, and we move on a slide, and we have to find out what consent means under EU law. It's not just as easy as tick a box and say I agree. You need 4 elements to give valid consent. It has to be freely given. It has to be specific. It has to be informed. You have to tell people what it is they're consenting to before they agree. And it has to be unambiguous. They really have to know and say, yes, I agree to that thing you have proposed. So we'll move on again. And we'll go into the question of what it is to be to give freely given consent. Slide number 5. Here we are. So one of the difficulties the state had is that the GDPR recognizes that there's a power imbalance between citizens and the state. And so it generally says that the state can't rely on consent in order to process data. Now, here the public authorities said, well, look, these people don't have to access this app if they don't want to. They don't have to install it. We don't make anything bad happen to them if they don't, except we think it would be good for the common cause, and we urge them to do it. But it's not like we fine them or take away their social welfare or perform any form of coercion to that effect. So we don't think, said the state, that there is a power imbalance here, and we think that there is valid consent. On balance, I think probably that's accurate, although there is a danger if you build in other things as well as just contact tracking. The more you build in on top of the contact tracing, the more likely it is that you've now made the app socially impossible not to have, and therefore you've now made the app not possible to give free and valid consent. But let's move on to stage 2. Let's say that we have succeeded, and we move on to what that recital says. Thank you. That's recital 43, and it explains that consent isn't generally a valid legal ground for processing personal data where there's a data imbalance. So we can just move past that. That's just to show you how specific it is. Now, free consent is granular consent. That means that if I agree to a certain thing happening in relation to my data in an app, particularly an app that I need agreement in order to get it. If I agree to that, I must be able to say, well, I agree to that, but I don't agree to this over here. I don't like this thing that you're suggesting that you would do with my data, but I am happy to do this. So, for example, in the Irish app, people had tracing alerts, but it was their business whether they wanted on receipt of the alert to put in their phone number, which would then be passed on to the state, so the state could ring them up and ask them who they'd been nearby. So this is the contact tracing chain. So you have to be able to agree to the processing and disagree with other bits of processing. If it's all bundled together, now none of the agreement was valid and it wasn't valid consent. So from the point of view of the people who want to be able to process this data in line with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, you actually have a benefit for splitting it out and giving people those choices. Let's move on. Now, not only do you have to do it, give free consent and have valid free consent, but you also have to only use the thing for a particular purpose. So if I collect the data for the purposes of contact tracing, I have to ensure that I only use it for the thing I told you that I would use it for. So that's okay. In this case, the state so the European Data Protection Board has issued a set of guidance in relation to these apps. And one of the pieces of guidance that they said was, this app should just do one thing. It should only do contact tracing and nothing else. And so they said, therefore, if you get consent to that, that's the only thing it's doing. You don't have to try and worry about the specific purpose because it's only one purpose. Now, of course, the state being the state, and the Irish state is not the worst at this, but then again, all states have similar pulls. Once they discovered that there was a chance of installing a piece of software on everybody's phone and that they could get information, I mean, who doesn't like information on the citizens? So there were a couple of additional kind of curly cues that they added to the app, where they would, as well as the contact tracing, they also wanted to know, I wonder if you'd tell us what your symptoms are. Internally, we refer to this as the snuffleometer, because this was an entirely self-assessed question. Once a day, they'd ask you, how are you feeling? Do you have any symptoms today? Do you think you're feeling good? Do you think you're feeling bad? And people would fill that in. And really, was that going to add anything to our knowledge? Well, the epidemiologists who wanted it said that they thought it might do. And look, who are we to argue? In the end, the state shipped it with more than one purpose. And so that was so we didn't get quite a specific purpose, but at least everybody was told what those purposes were, and the app was very well designed in terms of the delivery of those information. Let's go on to slide 9. This is the purpose. If you have specific purpose, you state it clearly, you use it only for the purpose that you've stated you're using it. The danger is function creep. You collect up people's information, you get them to install an app, and then the state realizes, well, while I have you, why don't I make this app an identity app or some other purpose that the state would love to have once we've had a mass take-up of a particular piece of software controlled by the state. So you can see that it's very important not to allow function creep, and we'll show you later on how we try to create a formula to ensure that that would be the case. Let's move on. I'm going to rattle through these because they're, informed consent. You've got to say what's going to happen to the data, and to be fair, again, this is complicated, a bit of an art to it, because not only do you have to give a full comprehensive statement, which is, the kind of the terms and conditions length of a statement we're used to reading and scrolling down through, but you're actually obliged not to just put a wall of text in front of people. You're obliged to say to them, well, look, here's what it is that we're going to do, but I'm presenting this in a way which is easy to understand for you so that you can give true, genuine informed consent, and I'm not just trying to blind you with science or throw a bunch of legal text in front of you. So, it's quite difficult to try and get to the point where you have both informed consent, you've given them all the information, but also you've got genuine free consent and granular consent because they understood all the information and they made their choices. And again, the Irish app did okay on this. It wasn't the worst, wasn't the best, but it certainly was better than the usual scroll down 3,000 pages and then click OK at the end. Now, on we go. Finally, I'm going to jump us through the next ones. There are requirements that you have to hit if you're going to say that you've given informed consent. You've got to hit these requirements. I don't intend to read them out. Let's pop on. Everyone can look at them later if they're feeling particularly sleep deprived. And you've got to say that the consent is unambiguous. Now, that's kind of interesting because you've got to make sure that the thing that you got from them is a very clear, yes, I want you to do this. And that's pretty important if you're going to use it for the purposes of tracking people's health, because health is treated as a special category of data under Article 9 of the GDPR. And therefore, if you're going to track health data, you've got to be really clear because you need to get extra high levels of to be able to demonstrate high levels of consent and high levels of compliance with the requirements to get consent. Now, on we go. Withdrawing consent. It's got to be easy to say no as it was to say yes. You're allowed to change your mind. You can have the data deleted. You also have lots of rights under the Data Protection Act. If it is that there is to be a centralized store of all of this information, then what will happen is that the individual has the right to say, what information are you collecting on me? I want to have a copy of it. What's the legal basis for each piece of information? What's the legal basis of each piece of processing that you're using that information for? I think that information is wrong. If it's wrong, then it can be corrected. And you need to have an independent body, which in Ireland is the Data Protection Commission, and in all the other EU countries, there are data protection authorities who you can go to if you're not happy with how your data is dealt with. So let's hop straight through the next one. And this is where we were looking at what it is you need to get valid consent. I think actually I've ended up with that slide twice. Apologies. So let's move straight on through that one. We don't like that one. Let's not look at it. Necessary and proportionate. And then we go straight to the ICCL DRI principle framework. Now, so this was a framework which was developed by the Irish Council for Civil Liberties and Digital Rights Ireland jointly. And the aim was to ensure that any development that was being done would be able to meet these requirements. The bullet points have been eaten by the gremlins of PowerPoint, but they would have to meet these requirements, and we could measure whether or not they've met these requirements and give a sort of a scorecard in relation to how the app could be trusted and whether it met the rights framework. So we said that you'll see that many of them are derived from the data protection law. It has to have a clear purpose, necessary and proportionate. But we also wanted things like that it would embrace transparency and would promote trust. You promoted trust and transparency because you needed people to download it. So this was good for both sides, the state and the individual, because without that level of trust, you just weren't going to get a take-up. And in most countries, the take-up faltered somewhere around 10 to 12%. Even the most, shall we say, obliging countries would find that they had difficulty trusting what the state was doing. So building that trust in, and also building to be able to demonstrate that they were trustworthy, was really key. Privacy and data protection by design. We wanted it subject to a sunset clause. We're in a crisis. It was here to meet the crisis, but we didn't want this app to hang around and morph into something else. So, for example, in the Irish case, this app will self-destruct, Mission Impossible style, in November 2020. We also wanted to make sure that what it was doing was effective. Now, Dr. Farrell from Trinity and his colleague did a great deal of work on the question of effectiveness, but it was really important from a legal point of view and from a rights point of view. If the app isn't effective, then it can't be necessary for any purpose. If it doesn't do what it's meant to do, then you can't need it in order to perform that action. So if you're not effective, you can't be necessary. And if you're not necessary, it can't possibly be proportionate. You have to hit all of those heads in order for it to be legitimate. So it really put a lot of emphasis on testing and demonstrating it was both trustworthy but also effective. Now, in truth, what we have seen is we've seen a pretty good accompaniment in terms of engagement, in terms of the transparency. The state published the source code on GitHub for everybody to look at. They published the data protection impact assessment for everybody to look at. And this is a kind of a process. This is unlike anything the state has ever done before. But then again, we've never had a situation where people's lives were at stake on a piece of software, potentially. And therefore, hats off, the state really did come up to the mark in terms of trying to get that level of trust. And from the state's point of view, they got a reward because Ireland currently, as far as we can see across the world, has the highest level of take-up. I think it reached 1 million downloads of the app within the first day and a half. And that's in a total population of about 5 million. So you can see that that's a very significant proportion of the A, adult population, and B, adult population who have smartphones. So they probably reached the magical threshold, or come very close to it just yet, of reaching the magical threshold, if we count every download as an active user, of about 60% of iPhone or Android smartphone holders. So this is a really big win in terms of the Irish state, if this app works. And the jury is still out on the effectiveness. That remains to be seen. There's assertions, rather thinly explained assertions, that the state did its own research and found it was 70% effective. Now, for a value of effective that you might choose, because we haven't been given what does effective mean, but nonetheless, it is over the first hurdle, which is it published the app. It published the source code. It published the data protection impact assessment. It published the usually very confidential comments by the Data Protection Commission, so we could compare them with what was actually done. In other words, they really made a big effort. And I should say, from a practical point of view, our engagement in terms of civil society really made a difference. Primarily, the plan was originally to run a centralized app where all the information would go into a central depot. That was dropped, even though they had actually gone a long way in building that app. And it was replaced by a decentralized model along the Google and Apple framework. Now, I suppose we'll bump on to the next one. And by having a framework like that, we were able to issue a kind of a scorecard where we took each one and we gave it a kind of a value to give the public a sense of where it was. And this came out as a C+, which if you've ever dealt with civil society privacy groups, you'll recognize that that's pretty much the best you're ever going to get in terms of this kind of a project. Jury's still out on the question of effectiveness, but as a framework and a model for implementing rights-based software at a population scale, I think that it has turned out to be one of the better examples that I've ever come across here or elsewhere. Now, that's the last slide. There's just a bunch of stuff about me, so ignore that. I wonder, does anybody want to ask any questions? Have I overrun my time, underrun my time? How does that work?
Time for maybe a few minutes of questions. Oops, sorry about that.
I can hear Jim Reed, but he's just being very quiet.
Can you hear me? I don't see any indication that my mic's been turned on.
Yes.
I hear Jim Reed.
Okay, Simon, great talk, wonderful stuff, and I congratulate everybody in Ireland on all the very hard work to make sure they get the basics of all these privacy concerns and GDPR compliance issues sorted out. I contrast that starkly with how things have gone in the UK. You know, let's not go over that, but I'll just contrast that. I'll just say there's a radically different approach there. But one thing I do wonder about the Irish approach to this, how much of the success of the tracing app is down to the policies of Google and Apple and their use of their platforms, because the UK model, as I'm sure you know, is to have the data sent to a centralized repository, and that's something which both Google and Apple were not at all keen on, and that's one of the reasons why the UK app has just crashed and burned.
Sorry, slight technical one while I worked out how to say things. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So this is Google and Apple's world, and everyone else has just been playing in it. So they have set the ground rules for how this may be done. And if you decided that you would strike off on your own, as the UK did, well, you can strike off on your own, and then you can fall off the edge of the world and not be seen again, which is what happened with the app. Because in reality, they can control whether or not any kind of framework has sufficient access to the Bluetooth sort of underlying technology to allow it to continue to track even while, for example, on the Apple screen, whether or not the phone was locked. I think at the original model that the Irish app was, the one they scrapped, and the one which I think the UK ploughed on with until recently, you had to keep your screen unlocked at all times. So you constantly had to be giving it a tap if you wanted it to stay awake and therefore still tracking. From a practical point of view, this was, you know, madness. So that hasn't really, that didn't really take off. And in reality, the fact that the Irish state went for a decentralized proposition, yes, they did so, and they cited data protection concerns. Yes, they were very audible. They were very, they really wanted people to learn about how trustworthy they were. But at base, they didn't really have a choice. Once Google and Apple had gone for that, everybody else had to follow. And on this occasion, that's privacy protecting, and that's good for privacy. But it does go to show that the concept of, I mean, one of our framework positions was controlled by statute. But in truth, we might control some elements of this app, but its underlying use of technology is not controlled by statute, but controlled by Cupertino and Mountain View.
Thanks, Simon.
Anybody else?
One more question.
Make this one a really good one and a hard one, so I make a horrible face when you say it.
interesting messages in the chat that I wish I had been able to pay attention to at the time. I would suggest actually more conversation in the HRPC list. I think there is so much more to say, and I know that Stephen and your team, you've all put out a lot of really interesting research lately. So please feel free to share it there to spark some more conversation. Thanks so much, Simon. We really appreciate your insights and your presentation today.
Not at all. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
All right. So we have Ava in the house who's presenting on. Yep, Ava, you're there. You're able to click at the top to share your video and your audio. I can let you in to do that, and I will stop sharing my screen. Start sharing my video. Hi, everybody. Great. There you are. I can't hear you, though. Let's see. You might have to actually share audio separately. There you are.
There.
Perfect. All right. It's all yours. Please.
Excellent. Hi, my name is Eva Galperin, and I am the Director of Cybersecurity for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And please excuse my quarantine hair. I am up very early in the morning in San Francisco in order to meet with people who are not getting up quite as early in the morning as me, and I'm a little bit bleary. But I am here to radicalize you. I was essentially brought in to give you a talk about whose internet is this. So one of the big problems that we have right now on the internet is that it is this fantastic tool for allowing people to communicate with one another and share information with one another, and also a tool for oppression and misinformation and censorship. And it is both of these things at once. So let's talk about how the internet can be used for good and how we can build this thing in a way that encourages the good stuff and discourages the bad stuff. So I wanted to start with a quote from my high school history teacher. My high school history teacher had a class on the Civil War in which she had no history book. And instead of a history book, what she did was she had us read all original sources. So diaries and documents and newspaper articles. And what she said, and I swear she's quoting Howard Zinn or somebody, but she didn't actually credit the quote at the time. So in my head, this is Sandra, my history teacher from high school. What she said was that if you are teaching the Civil War and you start with Abraham Lincoln, you're never going to get to Diary of a Slave Girl. And if you start with Diary of a Slave Girl, you will inevitably get to Abraham Lincoln. So this is sort of the approach that I want to take to the internet. One of the other things that I wanted to quote was, why should we have a human rights framework? When I went to Boston University just before Corona, when it was still possible to go places, and I was giving a talk at a symposium full of lawyers, and they asked me, well, what is the whole point of having a human rights framework? And specifically, they were asking about the GDPR, which is the strange, lengthy, and mysterious document to many Americans. And what I told them was essentially, and again, room full of lawyers, was that human rights are important because the law is sometimes bullshit. Because the law is not always just, because the law is not always right. And so we need to have some other sort of standard. This is one of the reasons why you end up with things like the UN Charter on Human Rights. You end up with the Court of Human Rights. You end up with things like the United States Constitution, which this whole idea of you have rights that cannot be violated by laws that are made came from. And it is important mind you, one of the biggest criticisms of human rights is that human rights is just a bludgeon that the West uses to sort of dunk on non-Western countries. China likes to complain about this a lot. The Soviet Union, before the end of the Cold War, liked to complain about it a lot. Basically, the Americans would get up in the UN and they would say, Russia, why are you sending your dissidents to gulags? This is a violation of human rights. And the Soviet Union would sit back and go, have you seen the way you treat your Black people? Human rights are not just for the countries that you don't like. And so I believe that we should have human rights in the United States and in the West as much as we do anywhere else. And I've spent, I would say, the last 13 years at EFF putting my money where my mouth is, which is to say that I've traveled all over the world and tried to help people come up with ways in which they can defend their human rights. But one of the things that I've really seen is this very depressing view of the internet. Once upon a time, I was a political science and international relations student. And the Cold War ended, and Francis Fukuyama wrote an essay called "The End of History," in which he basically said, capitalism has won, party time. And nothing of note has happened since then. We had this idea, I would say, around the time that I started working at EFF, that the internet was going to be a force for good, that it would allow people to see around censorship, that it would allow people to see through misinformation, that it would allow people to communicate and connect with each other like never before, and that this would be a force for civil society and for democracy and for transparency of government. And some of that happened. I would say definitely some of that happened. At the time when I started doing internet activism, one of the very first things that I studied was Chinese internet censorship. And the reason that I studied Chinese internet censorship was that it was the only censorship in town. The Chinese sort of Great Firewall model was viewed as an aberration. The idea was that there was one great big internet and that trying to censor it was absolutely not worth it and a complete pain in the ass, and surely no one but the Chinese will do this. Now the Chinese model is held up as an example by Russia, by Iran, who has been trying to implement a what they call the halal internet for many years. And by countries all over the world. They're like, hey, this whole idea where you censor everything and you keep very close watch and control on your people is wonderful. The other thing that the internet allows you to do, which we had not really thought about at the time, was that it allows you to be tracked. When I started doing activism in the early 2000s, we did not all carry tracking devices connected to the internet around in our pockets, but now we do. We have cell phones, our cell phones have internet access, our cell phones need to know where we are because otherwise our cell phones do not work. And you end up with all kinds of very strange folk wisdom about the situations in which you can and cannot be tracked by the government, which is sort of where this whole idea about tinfoil hats comes from, or putting your phone in the microwave. Don't turn the microwave on if you're going to put your phone in there. So people get all kinds of very weird ideas about how you can avoid government surveillance. And so EFF spent a lot of time working on government surveillance issues, which is sort of where we were around 2003 through 2007, when, because of a whistleblower named Mark Klein, we discovered that the telecommunications industry was working hand in hand with the NSA. The NSA was installing secret rooms in telecommunications centers all over the United States that were copying all of the information and all of the traffic, which at the time was largely unencrypted, and sending it to the NSA to hoover up and search through for presumably national security purposes. This was, we argued, on its face unconstitutional because it was a search of everybody's data without any kind of warrant or subpoena, and furthermore because the NSA is not allowed to spy on the communications of Americans inside of America, and a whole lot of these communications were the communications of Americans inside of America. There was no way that they were being sort of filtered out. This lawsuit became, I think, 3 different lawsuits by the EFF. There are additional lawsuits from the ACLU. I think we have been suing the either AT&T or Verizon or the US government about warrantless wiretapping for, going on 15 years. So quite some time. The wheels of justice move very, very, very slowly. So having said that, more recently, we had spent a lot of time explaining that we were very worried about government surveillance, and that the reason that we were worried about government surveillance is because governments have the guns. Governments have the power to send you to jail. Governments have what we called in political science class the monopoly on legitimate violence, or the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And what we discovered in the sort of ensuing years was that governments are not our only problem, not when it comes to censorship, not when it comes to spying, not when it comes to being invasive, not when it comes to misinformation. And increasingly, our communications happens on a set of very limited platforms, which are controlled by a limited number of countries and a very limited number of companies. And that has caused great disturbance in the force for a number of different reasons. If you are located in Europe, suddenly discovering that the US government was leveraging its sort of position in the center of all telecommunications to spy on people, or to spy on everyone, was a tremendous threat to their national security. Furthermore, if you were working at Google or Apple or any of the other large platforms that hold a whole lot of this data, a lot of them had an increasing problem, which was that they had US lawyers, they had people who understood what to do with requests for data from US law enforcement, from law enforcement even in most Western countries. But they were increasingly seeing requests from data from governments that were empowered to send subpoenas or warrants, but where the rule of law was not particularly strong, and where this sort of data request was being used to unmask critics, to de-anonymize critics, and also to silence them. So this was kind of a big deal. I don't know if you are familiar with cases in, let's come up with a few. One of the sort of most prominent ones that comes to mind is the president of Turkey, Erdogan, spent a lot of time sending legal requests to companies like Google and Yahoo in order to find out who was criticizing him, and further because they made criticizing the president illegal in Turkey, and spent a great deal of time prosecuting people who made mean memes about Erdogan. This is the actual way that he spent his time. And so in the interest of preserving human rights, which includes the ability to make mean memes about your president, we had to spend some time thinking about how companies should properly respond to these kinds of requests. And what the conclusion that we came to was the transparency report. So companies would publish transparency reports. I think Google was the first, and then Twitter followed, and now it's a fairly standard thing that you see from a whole lot of companies. They publish quarterly transparency reports, which tell you how many requests they got from the government and how many of them they actually complied with, and which government was making these requests. And this includes not just requests for data about users, but also copyright data, because I don't know if you're familiar with the works of my colleague Cory Doctorow, but copyright law is frequently used as a sort of backdoor to censorship, to censor political foes. So what I want to propose, sort of on top of all of this, is that we think about what an internet would look like if it did not center the needs and the concerns of the powerful first. Because right now, when we talk about privacy and we talk about security online, we talk about the privacy and security largely of rich people, of people with iPhones, of corporations, of states. And the people who get left out of this conversation are usually the poor, people with less access to resources, minorities, people with unpopular political or religious views, dissidents, journalists. These people very frequently get, sort of left out on the edge. And when I first started bringing this sort of thing up in tech, I was informed that this is because these are edge cases. Most of the people that you're trying to sell your products to aren't these people. Syrian dissidents are not going to be buying a lot of antivirus tools. They're not going to be buying a lot of enterprise software. They're actually, banned under export control law from doing so. And therefore trying to keep people like that safe was simply not a priority for companies. And one of the things that I did was I went around to the companies and I tried to explain to them just how much they were hurting people by not having high levels of privacy and security working by default. And this includes things like two-factor authentication, HTTPS by default. I had a very funny argument with a Twitter engineer shortly after Twitter pushed everything, almost everything to HTTPS, and it essentially went like this. He said, "I gave you 95% of what you wanted. What more do you want?" And I replied with, "I am an activist. I want the other 5%. It was not enough that they were encrypting 95% of all Twitter traffic. All of it needed to go out over HTTPS in order to prevent it from being spied upon. So one of the things that I would really like for everybody in this sort of virtual room to think about when we are making products and when we are making standards and when we are making laws is how to center the people who need the protection the most instead of the people who need the money, instead of the people who are going to be spending the money, instead of the people with the power. And the reason for that is sort of is very similar to the reason why my history teacher insisted that we read Diary of a Slave Girl. And it's that if you start with Syrian dissidents, if you start with journalists and LGBTQ populations in Uganda, if you start with BLM activists in the United States, you will inevitably create a system which will also be safe and secure for the average user or for the average enterprise. But if you start with the concerns of the enterprise and then you try to work your way out to the edge cases, you will never get around to protecting the people who need it the most. All right, now I think we have 5 minutes of questions.
So much. I think we got to a really interesting place at the end. There was some chat activity, and I saw a few questions. Do folks want to come to the mic with those questions?
I thought I would maybe speak to what I'd said in the chat, which is that this doesn't come for free. And the reason why people choose not to do it is that the cost in usability and the cost in being competitive against the people who don't do it is really significant. If you design something that takes the extreme edge position on privacy and secrecy, that it trades off against a bunch of usability that other products have. And I think that's been shown again and again that most people go to the lower privacy solution. There are a lot more people on Facebook than there are on the much more secure systems. And part of that is that Facebook enables a bunch of things that you can't do while providing what you want there.
The key to understanding privacy and security is not the suggestion that we should all go live on a mountain and throw our devices into the nearest body of water. I am not suggesting that we build tools which are unusable and which don't allow us to communicate with other people. I am not suggesting that we all move immediately to PGP encrypted email. I want people to be able to communicate with one another. I think that this is extremely important, and I think that the history of privacy and security protecting apps has definitely demonstrated that the usability question is not trivial. Having said that,
something like WhatsApp that gives you the privacy and is also usable. It is important to acknowledge there's a trade-off there.
Oh yes, absolutely. But I do think it's important that users be able to give informed consent about what is happening with their data, who has their data and when they have it. And one other thing that we have shown over and over again in studies is that users don't understand what data they're producing, who has access to their data, and the circumstances under which they can get their hands on it.
Yeah, totally. And that, despite the problems with GDPR, I'm very much a fan of that approach of mandating these things, because then you're not competing against the companies that can not care about them.
I think we are in violent agreement.
What is required, yes. I think that's a large part of it, is having that, pushing for that regulatory framework and for the human rights to be encoded into law to the point that people have to follow them and can't choose not to take that path because of the trade-offs.
Great. I just wanted to point out too that within the context of the IETF, there's a draft called For the Users, which is really great and hopefully going to be published soon. It was in the last meeting with IAB Open, so I think that relates to this conversation a bit. Anyway, I want to get Niels in the queue. Thanks, Bron. Niels, did you leave the queue? Sorry.
Do you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
No, you're good.
Thanks so much, Mallory, and thanks so much, Eva, for that great talk. Would you have concrete ways for us to operationalize this view? Do you think, I'm not sure if you're very familiar with the work of this research group, but for instance, the draft guidelines or RFC 82, or indeed the document that Mallory just referenced to, the Internet is for the users, or even the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, what will we need to do to operationalize your vision for this other Internet in terms of Internet protocols and architecture?
I think we're really only just getting started. Like I have definitely come to this group because I'm trying to convince you guys to sort of go in the right direction, starting with the question of why should we even bother with human rights, and you know, moving into, you know, should everything be encrypted by default? Should people be required to use their real names? Should people be allowed to have anonymity online? I think that these are still things that we need to hash out. But one of the biggest problems we have right now is that the trade-offs are not clear. And we're not even having the discussion about what those trade-offs might be, or talking about the sort of cost to human rights when you have, say, a real names policy. And part of the reason for that is because legally they're allowed to do this. It is in fact perfectly legal for a company to have a real names policy with with its internet platform. Facebook's real names policy is probably the most prominent example of one of these. And that was a policy which endangered victims of domestic abuse, people who were performing under pseudonyms, people who were worried about stalking, people who were whistleblowers and journalists. It actually put people in physical danger, and I'm very concerned about it, or also silenced them. So I think that this is actually so broad that no, I cannot. I have spent a whole lot of time explaining to you why I cannot give you very specific technical sort of advice or suggestions, and it is because it's such a broad topic. I would need way more than half an hour.
Call out a couple things you said. There is a draft that used to be part of the research group on anonymity that has expired. It would be great if people wanted to pick that up again, because I think that would be a really interesting one, specifically for protocols. Related to the real names policy, we don't have anything like that going on at the IETF, although shout out to Gershbad, who did a review of an interesting one where it was sort of a mechanism to allow registrars to request IDs and identities before you could get a domain name. He did a really good job of calling that out for that particular thing. I think we're going to move on now, but just wanted to thank you for coming in and talking to us. Feel free to subscribe to our list, and maybe some of this will continue. Thanks to Niels and Braun for asking your questions. And I think Braun's point in particular could maybe have some additional nuanced debate, just because I do get the point, which is like there are these trade-offs. It's really interesting to be able to expose them and then figure out what to do because of the potential consequences of what he's saying, which is to have that have these protocols be bypassed. Anyway, with that, thanks again. Stick around. We have a couple more drafts to go over. We have about 30 minutes left. All right, cool. I'm up next. Okay. Give me just 1 second, folks.
All right.
I was finding my window. That is not working. Minako folks, I'm not sure it's allowing me to show slides anymore. It's just kind of saying Computer says no. All right, I'm gonna have to refresh my screen. Sorry, everybody, I'll be RB. I'm presenting on behalf of Stefan Couture from University of Montreal, who has been working on draft association for the last many months. I want to go slower. Thank you. Great. So Stefan, and with my help, has made some really significant changes that have been sent to the list. There's not been feedback, but I will signpost to you what those changes are and I think the decision that we need to make to move forward. The reason why we're working on draft association, just as a reminder, is that after 8280 was RFC'd, we wanted to dive deeper into the rights, all of the human rights that were treated in 8280, specifically drilling down freedom of expression and freedom of association and assembly, and draft association is the latter of those. So we treat association and assembly as one. I mean, they're not the same. We talk about that in the draft, but that's why the draft is together. Niels and Gisela were the original authors. At some point, Joe Hall was also an editor, and then Stefan has been an editor, an active editor for a while now. But spoiler alert, he wants to step down, so we'll get to that at the end, which is part of the reason I came in to help direct a little bit. In the last couple of meetings, we've been talking about association as needing to take a different path a bit. Mostly it was non-controversial recommendations to sort of revise the literature review. And we discussed the details of what that path looked like over the series of meetings and also interim meetings. So it was talked about a lot. There was very clearly consensus on taking this move forward, which has now been done. And we'd like to tell you about what happened and where we think it needs to go next. So Stefan has reconducted the literature review. And based on that literature review, there are some new sub-questions. I think also in order to redo the literature review, it was necessary to revise the research question, like the larger research question. So that was also done. And you can see it here. So now the new research question is a little bit more clear. What are the considerations of the right to freedom of assembly and association for protocol development? It's simple, it's straightforward, it's clear. And with that, we're able to conduct a literature review that attempted to answer what is already out there that might be relevant. After that lit review, oh, this is out of order. Very sorry. Some questions emerged. And actually, I'm going to get to those later. This is not out of order. This is exactly as planned. I wanted to talk about the difference now as opposed to the last version and we'll go through it point by point. Because Stefan is a sociologist, researcher, lots of experience, felt that there needed to be sort of reformulation about the relationships and testing and establishing, and that was sort of built into the research question and then how we approached it, looking at the sub-questions, and you'll see that as a sort of general aim in what follows. The literature review has changed. That has been sent to the list. It's in the newest version. And then these 7 new research sub-questions that I keep talking about but haven't yet shown you there are two ways to go with this. Sort of taking those research questions at their value now as a way to conduct the rest of the research on this document. It means that the use cases that were there before, also 7, unrelated, that's a coincidence, would maybe not be there in their current form. I think that there's some, looking at the sub-questions and the use case, the previous use cases side by side, I can see overlap, and I think that we would use a lot of that. But the sections would be dictated by the sub-questions, not by the use case, which in this, the way that it was done by Niels and Gisela kind of focuses on a piece of technology. This would be focused on the question, talking about specific technology and protocols, et cetera, sort of reversing that a bit. And then there's another direction we can go as well, which is to rethink the conclusions. So early on in this draft, it was stated that this draft did not intend to give guidelines around association and protocols, because that's already kind of done in 8280 and the guidelines draft that Gershbot is working on. I'm wondering if we shouldn't revisit that. And I don't think we should revisit it now. I think we should actually get through the next phase of the research, which is to look in depth at the use cases, and then see if our research into these sub-questions and use cases actually then produces something that we might call conclusions or guidelines. So I'm just saying we should maybe wait and see. So that's the second proposal there. I wanted to go over what has changed in the literature review, but I'm mindful of time and that I actually want to stop talking so that we have 5 minutes for questions. So I'm going to just ask you to read the draft. And if you want to look at the slides, it gives you some clear signposts on where you can, like where things change significantly. I do want to dwell on this slide, though, because these are the promised sub-questions, also sent to the list, but maybe not in the draft as it's currently updated. I can't quite recall where we came down on that, but nonetheless, I think they're really interesting. They're very specific, and it means that we have to be okay with perhaps not covering the entire world or universe of freedom of expression, or sorry, freedom of association and assembly and protocols, but actually just trying to look at these very interesting questions as a patchwork, and then getting some meaningful results from asking these questions. I'll just highlight a couple because I'm not going to read them all out. Like, 1 is great. Is it possible to distinguish peaceful and non-peaceful association from the perspective of protocol development? Does that question make sense? Like, how, because the ICCPR and the UDHR spend a lot of time talking about the difference between peaceful and non-peaceful. So if we're going to think about this in the context of protocols, we should consider, is it possible to distinguish? Then there's like further sub-questions, of course. Another one is the end, right? In general, what kind of human rights impact assessments should be made to incorporate the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association when developing protocols? That sort of nod to human rights impact assessments might open a large can of worms in the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, but it might be worth noting it here. And that's why that sub-question is quite interesting, because it allows us then to pull some of that research forward and talk about that a little bit in this context. These are up for debate and for questioning, so please do that. I said already that I think we should pause after we answer or try to answer the research sub-questions and decide what to do about the conclusion sections if and when we get there. And so these are what I'm asking for today. Can we agree that we're fine with the revision so far? Can we agree that the sub-questions are the right direction to take this in, and that we wait and see what to do about finalizing the draft for conclusions? Stefan is stepping down. We need another editor. This is like sort of chair hat now. If we can find another editor, that would be really great. And then also we need authors. So, if you'd like to take one of these sub-questions or all of them, please, reach out. We can talk about that. That's it. I'm coming back to you now for the queue and to put people in it with your responses, I hope. I appreciate the mentions that have happened in the chat. That's really great. It helps to have +1s. Any other responses in the chat or in the queue on the mic? Even better if you would like to be the editor, an editor, an author, please see me, because at the moment it's sort of me working on that. Hey, Aubrey, great. Welcome. You should be able to speak now, I think.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, just okay. It's a little soft, but go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Oh, I'm also hearing me, so I've got something wrong. Okay, but anyway, I really do appreciate the rewrite and the way you're looking at the questions, and I have done a read through of it, but haven't taken the time to comment on the list. So I just want to say that I certainly am very supportive of the revisions and the approach you're taking on this. And I like the idea of waiting to write conclusions until there's a draft to make conclusions on. So I think that's quite a clever solution. So I just wanted to add that. And while I'm at it, I wanted to add that I really appreciate that you're chairing this. I'm just sort of listening and listening and being able to participate. So thanks.
I'm glad you're pleased with it, Aubrey. If others are as well, please say so. It'd be great if you did +1s in the chat or in the notes, whatever. Niels.
If you want, I'd be happy to work on the draft with you. And thanks a lot for you and Stefan for redoing it in this very structured manner. I think it makes a lot of sense. So now let's see if we structurally go through those sub-questions, see what we can answer with what we have. But I think structure was what was called for, and structure is what we got. So great progress. Thanks a lot.
Because this is a large part of it is your work. I think, and also I'm like the least person to be thanked because Stefan did almost all of this. I just came in sort of towards the end, one, because he couldn't be here to present himself today. And so I was happy to take that on. And two, just towards the end when it was like, okay, we've done a lit review. There's some really interesting stuff that fell out of it. What do we do now? And so that's why we were communicating with the list. So I was just sort of shepherding, if anything. But it is going to be a group effort because I will say that these questions are super interesting, but they're not light. They're not easy or straightforward. So we need to do some heavy lifting as a group. And I think that we care about this draft a lot. So let's do that. We also care about another draft a lot, which is the guidelines document. And I want to cue that up for Gershabad now. But Siobhan has something to say first. Go ahead, Siobhan.
Hey, man. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I agree with the general sense, the proposed actions. Just a comment on the latest draft that I read after a while. It does seem like it talks a lot about, in places, about centralization. And I'm just wondering if that should be here, given that there's another draft around centralization elsewhere, or if it needs to be. If the authors feel like it needs to be talked about, then maybe address that firmly about the relationship between centralization as a principle and association and assembly. Because especially in protocols and platforms, there was some talk about how platforms are centralized and how that leads to some problems with assembly. So just a comment after having read the latest draft.
No, thank you for bringing that up. Another one that really surprised me in doing the research or reading over, what Stefan did and helping through the question making was that there wasn't a lot on interoperability, which I feel like is very similar to the idea of centralization, right? Like interoperability and centralization are maybe two sides of the same coin in some ways, or one is an enabler of dealing with the effects of the other. Anyway, just to note that there is a gap in what already exists. So like the literature review brought up a lot of genuine research gaps that I think that this paper can address. But I also want to just make sure we get into the notes that we shouldn't be rewriting that. We should be referencing it when it's being discussed and talked about in other parts of the IETF, which we really hope to do. We really hope we can reference an RFC on such a thing. If not, we'll reference a draft or even When it comes to centralization, there's an actual publication in a different journal about such thing. We can also think about referencing that. Okie doke. Thanks, everybody. We will hear more, hopefully, at the next meeting, although that very much depends on how much interest we get from authors and hopefully an editor. So let me queue up guidelines, unless Gershabad, you want to, let me queue it up for you. You can test your audio in the meantime. Okay. So you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Great.
I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, so this is a quick update on guidelines for human rights protocol protocol and architecture considerations, which is a draft adopted by the working group that Niels and I are co-editing. I mean, in this conversation, RFC 8280 has been referred to. This draft seeks to update the second part of that RFC, which is the guidelines. So it's a list of questions that can help document authors in the IETF or the IRTF answer questions on how their design affects human rights, and possibly also help draft a consideration section if they would like one for their document. So where we're at currently is that first I have to apologize that the promised changes are not done yet. So there are two things we need to address. There are certain explanations with guidelines, and there are a few guidelines that do not have an accompanying explanation, which we're hoping to add in the next update. And the second thing to address, which I think has become more relevant recently, is the question on the human right of the right to legal remedy. And one person articulated, John Curran on the list articulated as as it may call for a protocol element of change that enables attribution to certain actors. And because of the recent conversations about traceability and attribution in Brazil and India, I think that question has become even more relevant. So those are the two changes that are coming. But hopefully this time we can also use to address another question, which is that for quite a while we haven't received some substantive additional feedback on the draft. So wanted to also get everyone's thoughts, maybe here on the list or otherwise, on whether after these changes you'd like to see this go to research group last call, or if you are already using it and you still sort of haven't shared your feedback with me, Niels, or on the list, that is always welcome. Yes, I'll stop for now, but if everyone thinks that after these changes it's good to go to research group last call, I think that's something I'd be happy to. Thank you.
Did you want to go back to any of these slides? Because I just realized I steamrolled your presentation by going
No worries.
so fast.
Yeah, I think I've sort of spoken about everything in the slides as well. So yeah, that's cool. Thanks, Mal.
Okay. I mean, for me personally, I think that we should move the draft to last call because there hasn't been much activity. And I also think that you, as the author, have been thinking very carefully about this draft for a long time. And you would have picked up on things that others are not bringing forward, but what might have been missed. But one question for you before that, do you think that you would want to change it in any significant way before you send it for last call? Because I know that you wanted to do an update before this meeting, but didn't.
Yes, so that's the sort of update I'm hoping to push before we go to last call, and that will just add an explanation or two here and there. There's Perhaps I mean, I do have a draft of a section on attribution that I hope to publish in the next update to the draft. I hope that will not be very contentious, but it might be. I don't want to make a prediction on that front. But I think after those two changes, I have nothing else in mind. So some part of the role, I mean, especially as co-editors, I think has been to take feedback from people who have been writing reviews or using the draft. So I know that the draft is still being used for reviews, etc. But we haven't had any feedback in a while. So perhaps that's the sort of motivation for perhaps if we want to move to RG last call after these two changes.
I hope that answers your question in the chat, Nick. Anyone else want to weigh in on the question of pushing to last call? I think it'd be great if you did do the updated draft and then request on the list exactly that, and we can, as co-chairs and with Colin's help, action that hopefully. But any other feedback at this time?
Please.
Absolutely. So next question is last call the right way to get people to provide that feedback? I think that what I meant is that all like the draft's writing, like Gershabad's work, has been driven by that feedback all along. So what's already there is it's already there. But Gershabad's going to clarify. You can send audio now, Gershabad, if you want to clarify. Okay. All right, we do have one last agenda item. Okay, Siobhan, yes. Go for it.
But just wanted to say that I guess maybe it's too late to change scope right now, but again, just going through it again after a long time, I'm just wondering the updated version, the updating that we're doing from 80 to 80 is the fact that we're adding some questions on top of 80 to 80, right?
Back in the queue, sorry. Or jump back on audio.
I think there is, sorry. Can I?
No, go ahead. It's fine. Go ahead.
So I think it went a bit further than adding questions. We refined the questions based on feedback. We added better examples and tried to improve the methodology of doing the testing. Because when we wrote RFC 80-80, a lot of stuff was still largely speculative because we had only done 2 reviews. And then based on a lot of new reviews, a lot of new issues came up, but also some reviewers thought some questions were unclear or some examples were introducing ambiguity, and I think we've removed as much as we could from there now, and this is the product of that work. And plus, another reason for doing this was a lot of people thought RFC 80-80 was too long before getting there. This is then the much shorter version, and then like the adult 1.0 version of the human rights considerations for protocols and architecture considerations.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. I mean, I feel like it is still pretty long. So if the objective is to provide a quick, like a questionnaire that people can use when they're trying to review a document, then I would, then I just feel like I would take part of this draft. But if the aim of the document is to be more like a research into human rights consideration, which is what 80-80 was, then I would take the whole of the draft. I mean, so I guess, yeah, so, or is it that as it is an updated research into human rights considerations, it also fulfills the first purpose? Yeah, I mean, I guess in other words, I just feel like I don't necessarily see these as guidelines. I see them more as research, expanded research into human rights considerations. And in that way, it's an update to 8280. But yeah, I mean, that's just a,
I think you're raising an important point. No, I mean, I sort of see it as like 8280 was the research. It was like the baseline setting scoping of where are we going to start, right? Where does one start when they think about protocols and human rights? Those are the considerations that you need to incorporate. I think guidelines is just meant to be the practical version of that. The thing that you can take and do something with it after learning all the things that we learned from 8280. And I do think that for a checklist, I mean, I found really helpful something that Gershabad created in, I think it's posted maybe somewhere in GitHub or GitLab. It's like it's literally a worksheet that just takes all the questions out of 8280 or maybe guidelines and just puts them in a spreadsheet, and you can tick off the boxes if you're, doing a review.
Right.
That I think is what you're wanting, Siobhan, which I think is a sort of spin-off product / tool that comes from, a research draft like guidelines. Or would you sort of categorize these three things, 8280, guidelines, a checklist, as in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that's just what I was wondering. So I did hear that framing that, it is a checklist, but I just don't think this current document is a checklist. The GitLab thing that you said, like, that's much more of a checklist. So it's fine if this is, and like an 8280 2.0, but that should really be the framing, I think.
So there's a suggestion in chat to possibly add the worksheet as an appendix, which I like that idea very much. And I think that we could think of the guidelines draft as a guide to the checklist, right? It's like, here's the checklist. It's going to be super useful for you. If you want to go back and reference like how we came up with these questions or the research that's behind them, then, here's the rest of that. Here's the rest of the draft. Go ahead, Gershabad. Glad you're back from your PowerCat situation.
Sorry about that. I did hear Siobhan's comment, and yes, that's a useful point. I think so. There are two parts of 8280, right? And one of them is I think the more human rights research part, and which links it to protocols, and then a separate section on the guidelines. So this document is supposed to update just the guidelines part of that, and so therefore it looks similar in structure and style in that regard. I still think that the meat of the document is the questions, but of course there are explanations appended with associated with each question. Maybe one thing to do would be to move the explanations to an appendix, and I saw a similar comment in the chat, I think. So point well taken. I think we can work with either of the designs.
Yeah, thanks.
Do that. Let's play around with making a possible checklist as an appendix and see if we can make it look nice. Any other points on this? We're over time, just to acknowledge that. So thanks for those who are still hanging on. We did have one last agenda point. If we want to move on from this, Aubrey, awesome. Go ahead.
Can be heard, yes. Okay, yeah, just a brief point. At the last meeting, I brought up the idea of starting a parallel track to the internet draft. Basically something that resembled a journal, whether published or online. While there's some concern about it that it would sap our strength or our resources, I've also got a fair amount of support for the idea. So I have continued working on it. What I've been doing lately is basically see if I can find someone to be willing to publish that. And the thought that I'm having is that, because it's been a suggestion.
Aubrey, I don't mean to interrupt. I think some of us are having a hard time hearing you. It might be the volume. Is it possible to speak just a little closer to your mic? And let's see if that doesn't resolve it. Or it's a network thing.
Okay.
I don't know.
It's probably me. I'm also hearing an echo that I don't know how to get rid of. So that's disconcerting me just a slight bit. So anyhow, in looking at this, still looking for someone that's interested in taking it on and publishing it. And I thought I had someone I'd be able to say something about that today, but I don't. And also looking at the idea of, while doing published, also looking at something on the web. I'm going to continue working on this. Anybody that's interested in working with me on it, please let me know either directly or on the list. One of the other I've got is, if we're doing it, what is the topic for the first one? And I'll leave it at that for over time. I'm happy to take questions, but moving it to the list and such is a fine way to do it. And I'll follow up. Hopefully, my life a little bit more adjusted to taking time on it at the moment. It's been sort of a bother lately. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Aubrey. It kind of got a little bit better the second time round, and I'm happy to just give a really quick overview. I think it's fine. I think we have 5 more minutes until we're absolutely booted out of Meet Echo. But the idea is the last point in the agenda here. We've been talking for a while about other avenues for publishing the research that has been adopted by this research group, and one of the possible options is a journal. And there's a call to people who are interested in working on this idea to support Aubrey and looking for concrete places to do so. And also, I think you had a question there about timing, like when the first edition might come out. Is that right, Aubrey?
It wasn't so much when, and I figure it'll take us close to a year from the time we say yes, it's a go. And so I'm really not looking for something immediate, but basically to get to the point where we start working on it and get to the point where I can find a slot in someone's publication schedule.
Thank you for restating that. Your audio now is perfect. So yeah, if that clarifies things for people. I think that's a reason.
Shouting at it.
Well, it's working. Keep it up. Any comments on this? Anybody want to weigh in? Okay, I think it's good to set expectations around how long it might take to get rolling, but I do want, from when it starts, right? So I do want to just emphasize the call for people who are interested in pursuing that with Aubrey to reach out. I think that's it, everyone. We've had a good meeting. We appreciate our speakers and our authors, and hoping that we can take some of these to the list. I'm looking forward to new versions of both association and guidelines, and wishing you all a good rest of your day and a good IETF 108. Stay safe and healthy, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.